Kick's older brother, Joe Jr., admired the Führer as well, writing that Hitler was smart to seize upon a common enemy, someone of whom to make the scapegoat. Too bad it had to be done to the Jews. The dislike of the Jews, however, he continued, was well-founded. They were at the heads of all the big business, on law, etc. It is all to their credit for them to get so far, but their methods had become quite unscrupulous. The lawyers and prominent judges were Jews, and if you had a case against a Jew, you were nearly always sure to lose it. As far as the brutality is concerned, it must have been necessary to use some, end quote. Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and we are walking through Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not. It takes the familiar stories of the Kennedys, but is telling them through the lens of the women involved, and often shows us the way that these women's lives were destroyed through circumstances and choices that Kennedy men made. I've created a chart. Today's discussion is about Kick Kennedy. She was the fourth of 9 Kennedy children. We have Joe Jr. was the first son, killed in World War II. Then JFK. Then we have Rosemary Kennedy. There is a chapter about her later in the book. But today we have Kathleen Kennedy, who was nicknamed Kick. So we will be talking about Kick Kennedy today. The first thing I wanted to share with you is just that I just got back from the mountains and I am so excited to share these stories with you. I did not record anything while I was there, but I did read and read and read, and we have some wonderful stories in the next few chapters. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that with you. I actually wore this little shirt today in honor of the last hike we did in Colorado. We found wild strawberries. So I'm just bringing a little memory with me in today's video. The other thing that I wanted to get into before we start reading, which we will be doing a lot of reading today, is that when we first got into this book, I felt that the lack of chronology was jumpy and contributed to me feeling unstable as we read through. Like, we're talking about Carolyn in the 80s, and then we're talking about Jackie on November 23rd, 1963. But I think this chapter was the first one where, for me, the lack of chronology actually is a way that Mrs. Callahan is making us aware of different women and helping make them distinct. So I think after going through RFK Jr.'s wife, who their marriage was chronicled through the 90s and early 2000s, Kick Kennedy takes us all the way back to the 1930s. Specifically, 1938, she arrives in England. So let's get right into our reading today. Kick Kennedy was already famous when she arrived in England in 1938 at age 18. She and Jack were the stars among the U.S. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy's 9 children. Old Joe favored her openly. "All my ducks are swans," he said, but Kick is especially special. Okay, so just so we are all clear and on the same page, Joe Kennedy is the father of the Klan, and he was the ambassador to England, which is obviously a huge position. This is 1938, so it's right before World War II. So he has 9 children, but he says that even though all of his ducks are swans, meaning there's not an ugly duckling among his children, that Kick is especially special. When JFK met Jacqueline Bouvier some 20 years later, he was astounded at the similarities she had with Kick. The youthful stubbornness, the determination, the snobbery, the love of fashion, horseback riding, and swimming. Kick, like Jackie, had gone from debutante of the year to a career in journalism. Now, Kick was Jack's equal in every way, except when it came to sex. Her father left porn magazines on Jack's bed, open to particular pages. But her mother had a fit when Kik, still a virgin at age 23, fell in love. I think this is one of the first places in the book where we get a picture of how they were parented. And it's not good. Not only is it totally different between males and females, but the way that they are being treated, especially the young men, is so twisted. For their father to have purchased pornography for them and then leave it open to certain pages to try to get them to notice this woman or notice this particular thing that he wanted them to see, it's just so twisted. It's a purposeful stripping of their capacity for innocence and interaction with women in a way that wouldn't cheapen and objectify the act of sexual intimacy. So it's just twisted. So we are seeing, though, that she is about to fall in love. Kik and Billy were opposites in every way. He was tall, she was tiny. He was slow in thought, speech, and movement. Kik was electric. He had an aristocratic bearing, but Kik had no use for any of that. She showed her affection through jokes and gentle mockery. She was American, he was not. She was Catholic, he was Protestant. Kik was born Kathleen. He was born William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to a mansion in London, a castle in Ireland, and descendant of a 17th century namesake who had helped to dethrone a Catholic king. But together they fit. He quickly became her Billy. Kik was the American empress of the jazz age, a screwball heroine out of the Hollywood movies she adored, fond of throwing parties in her father's new residence, which was a crumbling old pile with 52 rooms and a basement where Joe stashed 2,000 bottles of champagne. Her days were spent shooting grouse, cheering at the races, playing tennis, and attending garden parties at Buckingham Palace or luncheons at St. James's Palace. At this, I want to note, I looked it up. Queen Elizabeth was 6 years younger than Kik. So just for your placement as you're thinking about all of this, this is toward the end of the Downton Abbey type era, and Kik was a little bit older than Queen Elizabeth, just for your perspective. Her nights were spent in London's poshest clubs, theaters, restaurants, at cocktail parties and castles, with maids attending to tasks both great and small, even squeezing toothpaste onto waiting toothbrushes that were angled just so. Kik was among the beautiful and privileged youth of England, partying at the edge of the world, losing themselves in midnight strolls through grand topiary mazes on even grander estates. Young women in gowns of the finest silk or gossamer chiffon strolling through damp, verdant grass, swinging champagne bottles in one hand and lit cigarettes in the other. Each night they were drinking away the looming specter of Hitler and the approaching horrors. All you can hear or talk about at this point is the future war which is bound to come, she wrote in September 1938. I am so darn sick of it. So we have this picture of Kik in the jazz age. It's this carefree moment between World War I and the Great Depression, but just before World War II. So this is the world she inhabits. Before Billy, Kik had a singular kinship with her mother, Rose. No other Kennedy child defended Rose from Joe's constant womanizing. But now that loyalty seemed to mean nothing. Kik knew her mother might not approve of Billy's religion, but she never anticipated her mother's cruelty. She never anticipated her mother disowning her. After all, Rose's own parents hadn't approved of Joe Kennedy, but she had married him anyway. Billy's father was aghast at the romance, just like Rose. The Devonshires were anti-Catholic. Billy and Kik were, in essence, a Montague and a Capulet. But how could their parents care about such things now with their young lives at stake, the world as they knew it careening toward the abyss? There was no question that when the war came, Billy would serve in combat, and there was no question that Ambassador Kennedy would order his children back to the States, whether they were adults or not, once the war broke out. So it's not just the world careening toward an abyss, but their relationship is also headed in the direction of this chasm. In fall 1939, 18 months after docking in England, Kik was back in America. Her first salvo was a thank you letter to her father, quote, "for giving me one of the greatest experiences anyone could have had," end quote. She did not reference the terror. In anticipation of the Blitz, London had begun going dark in September 1939. A zombie city at night, aerial bombings imminent. Kik bided her time in New York, returning to her former life as just a Kennedy girl. No longer the brash American. Her worldview had been broadened and deepened by her British friends, all of whom were won over by her joie de vivre, her unpretentiousness, her willingness to learn and change her mind. Kik's greatest conflict with her father had nothing to do with Billy at all, but with Hitler and America's role in the war. Joe, as U.S. ambassador to the UK, had sought to meet with Hitler and had encouraged appeasement with the Nazis. He thought that democracy in Western Europe and America would soon be dead, and that Germany would establish a new world order, one that he, in fact, agreed with. Joe Sr. blamed the Jew media in the United States, as he wrote to Viscountess Nancy Astor, condemning their coverage of Hitler. Kik's older brother, Joe Jr., admired the Fuhrer as well, writing that Hitler was smart to seize upon a common enemy, someone of whom to make the scapegoat. Too bad it had to be done to the Jews. The dislike of the Jews, however, he continued, was well-founded. They were at the heads of all the big business on law, etc. It is all to their credit for them to get so far, but their methods had become quite unscrupulous. The lawyers and prominent judges were Jews, and if you had a case against a Jew, you were nearly always sure to lose it. As far as the brutality is concerned, it must have been necessary to use some, end quote. Kik's father was grooming Joe Jr. to run for president of the United States. She realizes that Catholicism is not their one true religion. Power is. So, before we move on, I just want to point out that Edward, who abdicated, also thought that Britain's role should be appeasement and that they should participate with Hitler and build inroads with him. Edward and Wallace continued to do that even after abdication. And so this was not an uncommon view that Hitler's rise was inevitable, that the West would fall to some degree, and that they needed to be able to pivot. You see Edward and Wallace pivoting by kind of entertaining those relationships with Nazis. And so here we see that Joe Kennedy held these views, and he was the ambassador to England, so he's advising those Brits on what they should do and what the American perspective is on Hitler. Joe Sr. has successfully passed that view to Joe Jr., and he is kind of grooming him to be president in the same sort of view as Edward, to become a leader who will acquiesce to Hitler. Kik returned to America believing, unlike her father and brother, that Hitler must be defeated. She was proud of Billy for enlisting and frantic to see him. She wrote a letter to old Joe in May 1940. At the moment, it looks as if the Germans will be in England before you read this letter. But she reiterated her belief in Britain's moral and military supremacy. I still keep telling everyone the British lose the battles, but they win the wars. I've received some rather gloomy letters. Daddy, I must know exactly what has happened to them. Is Billy all right? Jack, this would be JFK, Jack, equally convinced that democracy would not survive World War II, wrote to their father on Kik's behalf. Kik is very keen to go over, and I wouldn't think the anti-American feeling might hurt her like it might do us due to her being a girl. Kik couldn't just wait around as if she was some incipient war widow. She dabbled in schools in New York and in Florida, and in 1941, she got herself a job at the Washington Times-Herald as a research assistant. She found herself drawn to a man named John White, a 30-year-old reporter and inveterate debater. He was also a minister's son with a snake tattoo on his arm. Again, just to put this in context, tattoos were really pretty rare at this time, so this is indicative of something that it's no longer indicative of. Tattoos may still hold some taboos in our culture, but at this point, tattoos were a very big deal. And so for him to be a minister's son with a snake tattoo says something about this guy. This guy was Kik's Speed, another rebel. White liked Kik a lot, but her dogmatic opinions surprised him. Birth control is murder, she'd say. Premarital sex? Well, that was out too. How could such a firebrand be so dogmatic? Everyone knew what the Kennedy boys got up to, he thought. Birth control was the least of it. But as he got interested in Kik, he realizes that old Joe had hired someone to investigate him. Kik's brother Jack was allowed to date whomever he wanted, including their friend and colleague, Inga Arvid. Rumor had it that Inga, who he called Inga Binga, that she might be a spy for Germany. But did old Joe care about that? No. Now, he cared that Kik remained a virgin till marriage. And oh, how that frustrated John White. This is Snake Tattoo Man. After they went out for dinner or a movie, Kik would sometimes allow John to come back to her place. She'd let him sit on the bed, rub her back, but nothing else. When White would press for more, Kik would only say, "That's the way it is." He tried to kiss her once. She shied away. "I don't want any of this, John. You must understand. Please don't try. I don't want the thing that the priest says not to do." Whether it was because of her childlike effect or despite of it, John fell in love with Kik. They shared newsroom banter, and he called her an ignorant, thick-headed Mick, and she called him a shrinking, bald-headed, irritable old man. White often said that Kik was the most fun to argue with because she was always wrong. She kept circling back to her birth control arguments, and she thinks about the conversations that she had in Britain. And it reminds her of Billy. "I'm nearly going mad," she told her father. Well, Jack is now as pessimistic as his father, and he begins trying to talk Kik out of it. "I would strongly advise against any voyages to England to marry any Englishman," Jack writes to Kik. "For I have come to the reluctant conclusion that it has come time to write the obituary of the British Empire." So this tells us Jack Kennedy's thinking in anticipation of what would happen during World War II. He thinks that England will be no more. Yet, by March of 1942, Jack himself was off to war. It took Kik another 15 months, but her stubbornness did pay off. On June 23rd, 1943, she boarded the Queen Mary as a new member of the Red Cross, headed to London to Billy. They married on May 6th, 1944, in a 7-minute-long civil ceremony. She wore a knee-length pink crepe dress with tea-length sleeves and a high neck, a copy of one of her own black dresses. Everyone she knew in England, even her milkman, had given Kik their clothing ration coupons for her modest wedding dress, a testament to how much they loved her, this young woman whose wealthy family was so withholding. This clarifies for us what's happening. She is marrying him, and yet, even though she has a very wealthy family, they don't send any money to support her. Instead, the Brits are piecing together their clothing ration coupons, which at this time was a way of making sure that everyone, had enough bread, had enough fabric, had enough of whatever they needed without it overrunning supplies during the war. All of these community members pool their clothing rations to give her her wedding gown because her parents are unsupportive. The book says, On her wedding ring, Billy had inscribed, "I love you more than anything in the world." Only one member of her family was present, her brother Joe Jr., who was serving in London. He had to defend himself for smiling in Kik's wedding pictures. "I saw no point in looking extremely grim throughout," he wrote the family, "so I looked as if I enjoyed it." As far as America was concerned, Joe thought that Kik was now royalty, on her way to dizzying heights of glory and power. None of it impresses her mother. Rose had taken the advice of a newspaper publisher, and as a means of boycotting the wedding without seeming vengeful, she has herself hospitalized for 2 weeks, and then issued a statement saying that she was physically unfit to discuss the wedding with anyone. So not only does she not attend, but she won't do an interview about it. There's not going to be any quotes from Rose Kennedy about her daughter's wedding, which is just so sad. When this news reached Kik, it devastated her. She didn't recognize this as histrionics, a temper tantrum meant to shame her. She is silent and sorrowful. Billy's father, the Duke of Cavendish, described Kik as a sort of evil influence, even as she promised to raise her future children Protestant. So each of them have families that are none too pleased with this wedding. But her beloved brother Jack was thrilled for her. Shortly after the wedding, he wrote, "It's a horrible thing, but it will be nice visiting her after the war, so we might as well face it." This reminds me of that Kennedy quote we heard earlier in another chapter of "just get on with it." He's like, well, okay, she's married to a Protestant, and oh well, we'll get to visit after the war. Well, Kik has married the love of her life, and Jack noted that he was Britain's most eligible bachelor. She was profiled in Vogue, and she was approached by Life magazine. This was seen as a marriage between British royalty and American royalty of sorts. But it still wasn't good enough for Rose. Kik and Billy had just a few weeks before he would be called back to duty. Their wedding night was spent at Compton Place, a Devonshire mansion that was richly decorated. A suite was ready and waiting for them, and Kik watched as Billy looked at the twin beds that had been pushed together and hastily pulled them apart. She later confided to two friends that her wedding night had been a disappointment, that Billy was terribly inexperienced. Oh, Billy, the dashing bachelor who was probably a virgin. As I read this, I just thought, this is so topsy-turvy. Instead of enjoying the fruit of marriage together, instead of wading into these waters of intimacy together, neither one of you experienced, especially because we've just been told he gave her a ring that was inscribed, "I love you more than anything in the world." So this is a young man with whom she could have taken the perspective of learning together. And instead, my guess is, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, my guess is that her perspective has also been skewed by her father's teaching and expectations of the norms of men. So she had gotten the message that these brothers get pornography, so they're all super worldly and experienced in this area. She was supposed to be the chaste virgin, and so she doesn't really know what to do with a young man who is also a virgin and also walking into this unexperienced and needing to mature and grow in his ability to interact in this way. I just couldn't help thinking that this was such a glimpse of dereliction of duty on the part of parents, that she was unprepared for this potential with him, and that this couldn't have been a time when they go in joyfully together, especially because they seem to have had a lot of joy together in their relationship, and clearly he loves her. So it just made me sad to read that she was disappointed in this way when she could have taken it as a joyful indication of his fidelity and kind of innocence reserved for her. Well, they moved into a hotel awaiting Billy's orders. Kik was going to make this marriage work, and she wasn't going to give Rose an inch of satisfaction. In fact, she writes home and she says, "I am feeling better now than I have since I left America. This is the first really good rest I have had for a year. I have put on some weight." This was a dig at her parents, who vocally detested the slightest weight gain. "And I'm getting plenty of sleep. Married life," all caps, "married life agrees with me." Well, they had a brief honeymoon together at the legendary Swan Inn, and they were given the best room. This sounds fantastic. Listen to their experiences. They had running water, a fireplace, and dinner set out for them every night. They luxuriated in picnics and bike rides through the countryside, and they fantasized together about their lives after a war that was escalating beyond comprehension. It just seems so sweet, the bicycle rides out in the English countryside. You can just picture it. If you've seen, I think the show is named Home Fires. It's about British women during World War II. Makes me think of that, the sweet little bike rides and people in cute little smart uniforms and suits pedaling around Britain. Very sweet. She continues, "Billy would die just 4 months after the wedding, killed in action by a German sniper. Rose was not sorry. She wouldn't be." Kik had returned to the States on August 16th upon hearing that her brother Joe had been killed while flying a combat mission. So they were married in May. In August, late August, her brother is killed. So she returns back, perhaps in September. And 1 month later, her husband dies. 1 month later, Billy had been killed in combat, shot in the heart in Belgium. She grieves this loss mostly alone, her siblings acting as if nothing was amiss, except Jack. He sat up with her in a New York City hotel the night that she learned of Billy's death. Jack said he had not experienced a worse night. "So ends the story of Billy and Kik," she wrote in her diary. "Life is so cruel." She treasured a letter that Billy had written to her, and she reread it often. Here is how it sounds. "I've been spending a lovely hour on the ground and thinking in a nice, vague, sleepy way about you and what a lot I've got to look forward to if I come through this all right. I feel I may talk about it for the moment, as I'm not in danger, and I'll just say that if anything should happen to me, I shall be wanting you to try to isolate our life together, to face its finish, and to start a new one as soon as you feel you can. I hope that you will marry again quite soon, someone good and nice." Think about the heart behind that letter. He truly did love her. Those are the thoughts of someone who's reckoning with his own potential death and advising his young bride to move on with joy and not with guilt. It's such a kindness. Heartbreaking letter. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill sent personal condolences, but these were small comfort. Even as a grieving young wartime widow, she was still, in her mother's eyes, a sinner. Rose's rejection stung all the more after Kik received a beautiful letter from Billy's mother, somehow strong enough to console this shattered young woman. Listen to this letter. "I want you never, never to forget what complete happiness you gave him. All your life, you must think that you brought complete happiness to one person. He wrote that to me when he went to the front. I want you to know this, for I know what great conscientiousness struggles you went through before you married Billy, but I know that it will be a source of infinite consolation to you now that you decided as you did. All your life I shall love you, not only for yourself, but that you gave such perfect happiness to my son, whom I loved above anything in the world. May you be given the strength to carry you through these truly terrible months. My heart breaks when I think of how much you have gone through in your young life. Wow. So we see where Billy got his kindness. His mother is so kind in her grief to be giving such acceptance and an indication of pride that Kik can take from her young marriage, her short marriage. She gives such kindness and empathy to the young widow, even while she's in surely such grief. So Kik returns to England, to the bosom of Billy's family. She described herself as a small cork tossing around the ocean. Her 18-year-old sister-in-law Elizabeth slept on the floor beside Kik's bed for many nights. And this was common at the time. Young widows would go into the home of their husband's family and be seen as part of his household rather than their own. Her father, old Joe, writes her a letter. He says, I think it's insightful of his affection for her. Mother and I were talking it over last night, he cabled her, and decided that nobody in the world 25 years of age has had the kind of life you've had, or as interesting. If you haven't kept a good diary of all this material, you've robbed yourself of another thrill, and that is writing a book. He tells her that she could have a most interesting contribution to make to the literary field. I think it's interesting that she feels such loathing from her mother, and yet her father is telling her that they're just sitting around discussing how brilliant and world-traveled and experienced she is. And I don't know if this is him trying to smooth things over between Rose and Kik, or if this is an actual truth and Rose was just putting on a front to have her Catholic pride, but actually was, in her heart of hearts, when they were having discussions at night, having goodwill toward Kik. Regardless, her father sends her a diamond and sapphire watch, and he bought an airplane so that he could see her more frequently. And he gave her this ultimate gift, his blessing for her to stay in England among Billy's family and friends, guilt-free. She was now free of the Kennedy directive. She was the only daughter that Joe encouraged to be independent, ineffably herself. It's interesting because I wonder, was this because of personality and because he singled her out? Or is this because of this era and how they viewed a widow? That if Billy had died 5 months sooner and they hadn't been married, she would have just had to come home and be under her father's household. But because she was now a widow, she was an independent woman, a marchioness, a woman of stature. We're not told, but that question came out in my mind. I'd love, if you know more about that era and its customs and norms, you can add your thoughts in the comments. I'd be interested to know. So London it was. Kik embarks on her life's second act. 2 days after what would have been her and Billy's first wedding anniversary, the war ended. And 1 year after that, she met Lord Peter Fitzwilliam at a ball. Fitzwilliam eyeballs Kik, slim and elegant in a soft pink gown, and then asks her to dance, his wife Olive's presence notwithstanding. Kik and Fitzwilliam's connection was instant and intense. Her father and brothers had no problem dating married women, so why should moral standards for her be any different? Kik was still living with her in-laws, clinging to her old life, and there were days, she said, when she felt Billy had been dead for 6 years and others 6 seconds. She was still actively grieving. But Fitzwilliam sparked something special in her. Tall, dark, and 10 years Kik's senior, he was a star in London's social set. Convivial, stylish, brave. He was a war hero, and he was exceedingly wealthy. He liked fast cars, fast boats, and fast women. He could provide Kik with the travel and luxury to which she was accustomed. And Fitzwilliam was probably more like her father and brothers than any other man she had ever met. True. True, we could say. He had infamously abandoned Olive on their honeymoon for another woman. He would bring his mistresses home for dinner or shooting weekends and parade them in front of his wife, whose job it was to make sure they were well fed and cared for. And when Olive decompensated and became an alcoholic, she was blamed for making Fitzwilliam's life a misery, not the other way around. This sounds exactly like Mary Richardson Kennedy in our last chapter. Poor Olive. Her husband is flaunting his infidelity, and she's just meant to just welcome them right in. Come to the shooting party. Let me get you dinner. Let me make sure you're cared for. Well, Kik was just supposed to be another of his flings, but as it turned out, she was different. She was so interesting to him, both intellectually and sexually. And as their affairs deepened, Kik confided only in Jack. And he came away thrilled for Kik, but realizes he's never been in love like that. And he doubts that he ever would be. Kik's friends and confidants, however, were alarmed. She was beginning to openly talk about marrying Fitzwilliam, which no one thought was a good idea. Their friend, who was an esteemed writer and a devout Catholic, tried to talk her out of it. He said, if you want to commit adultery or fornication and you can't resist, then do it. But realize what you are doing and don't give the final insult of apostasy. He's seeing this through a lens of faith and saying you can do whatever you want in your private hours, but don't think that you're going to marry this guy and actually create distance between you and God. He's seeing it as if the sin itself, the relationship itself, isn't also creating distance between she and God, that actually just getting married would do that. Her brother, Andrew Cavendish, was against it. Others told her it would be a terrible mistake, that Fitzwilliam was far too selfish and would make her life hell. He wasn't just a Protestant, but he was a soon-to-be divorced one. And Rose tells her that if Kik marries him, she would consider her daughter well and truly dead. Her mother's threat did not have the desired effect. If anything, she grew closer to her father. And so Joe actually does come closer. He agrees to meet Kik and Peter in Paris at the Ritz on a Saturday afternoon in May. To celebrate, she and Peter decided to fly to Cannes before Paris. Kik was so excited that she packed 2 suitcases for 3 days. She now had a wardrobe that reflected her position in society, but also this sexual sophistication that she felt that she was becoming. She had a whole suitcase full of expensive negligees and lacy underwear, garter belts, and birth control. No longer did Kik think that contraception was murder or that sex, as the Catholic Church and her mother believed, was only for procreation. Billy's death and her mother's hypocrisy. Just how Christian was it to disown your daughter for falling in love? All of these things had dislodged her doctrine. Kik knew now how fragile life could be, and she had no intention of sacrificing a thing. She had been through a crucible and emerged a woman of the world, so well regarded that she hosted Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen of England, and her sister, Princess Margaret, at the Cavendish estate. In a round-robin letter to her family back home, dated October 20th, 1946, Kik wrote, "The 2 princesses arrived last night just before tea. They are very sweet, but Princess Elizabeth is very royal and very hard to talk to. She has a sweet face, but dresses so badly. Her evening clothes make her look much fatter than she really is." I thought this was just a funny little vignette. We get a look at an American's view of the young Princess Elizabeth. And this, just in case you aren't aware, is the Queen Elizabeth, who just passed away a little over a year ago. It's coming up on 2 years in September. She was the longest reigning British monarch and did such faithful service to her country. But here we see that when she was young, Kit Kennedy, when she hung out with her, she thought that she was very royal, which is not the worst thing in the world, right? Princess Elizabeth needed to be cultivated and refined for the position that she was about to be in, and that she dressed really badly. That she looked much fatter than she really is. Again, not the worst insult in the world. Better to look fatter and not be fatter than perhaps the other way around. Well, for all of the Kennedy ways that she had shucked off, her obsession with weight and looks was not among them. For the plane ride to see her father, she chose a sleek, dark blue suit, a strand of pearls, her rosary beads, and her wedding ring. Even though she was in love, Billy was always with her. May 14th, 1948. Upon landing in Paris at 12:45 p.m., Peter whisked Kit off to an impromptu lunch at the Café de Paris, and they returned to the airport 3 hours later, flushed and buzzed from a lengthy, boozy meal. To Fitzwilliam's consternation, their pilot was refusing to fly. A massive storm had grounded all commercial flights, and Fitzwilliam's plane was a tiny thing, a twin-engine, 10-seater plane with 2 recently repaired propellers. Meteorologists had forbidden a takeoff, but Fitzwilliam insisted. I feel like this is foreshadowing the thing that we know is coming with the Carolyn Bessette and JFK incident. Fitzwilliam, this man who is so like a Kennedy, insists that they take off. Well, the last 20 minutes of that flight were so terrifying that everyone on board surely knew they were going to die. Their pilot lost communication with ground control and flew into the storm's eye. He likely couldn't tell if the plane was upside down, right side up, pulling toward the skies, or plummeting to earth. A wing was shorn off. One engine fell, and then the other. The tail detached. The little plane gained speed as it headed straight for a mountain. It took first responders 4 hours to reach the crash site. Kit's high heels had flown off her feet and landed near the wreckage. Co-pilot, who had heroically tried to pull the plane out of its death spiral, had nearly lost a finger in the attempt. He was found with devastating head wounds. Fitzwilliam was unrecognizable. Kit was found strapped into her seat, her back, her legs, pelvis, and jaw smashed. The wedding ring from Billy was still on her finger. At this point when I was reading, I just felt I wasn't ready to be done with Kit. It sounds like everyone who knew her except for Rose was taken in by her and valued being around her and found her to be a very fascinating young woman. And it's interesting to think about what influence she might have had in the Kennedy family had she lived. Her perspective might have done them some good, might have given them some maturity and a perspective that women could be more than just kind of naive, good Catholic girls who would put up with anything and be sexually uninterested, which is how the Kennedy men viewed women. But she didn't live. Joe Kennedy immediately took a train to the small French region to identify Kit, and before leaving, he memorialized his daughter in his diary, which he doubtless knew would be published after his death. This is what he wrote. No one who knew her didn't feel that life was much better than that minute. And probably we know so little about the next world that we must think that they wanted just such a wonderful girl for themselves. We must not feel sorry for her, but for ourselves. Well, the Kennedys made no arrangements to bring Kit's body home. Her in-laws, with whom she had been living at the time, offered to bury Kit in their own family plot. Joe agreed and was the only Kennedy to attend Kit's funeral. Jack was too distraught. Rose took Kit's death as proof that she had been right. God struck down her daughter, the sinner, the sexual savage. Rose flat out refused to attend Kik's funeral and said Kik would be denied heaven and stuck in purgatory. One of Jack's friends, Lem Billings, it says he was perhaps the only non-Kennedy to know Rose's true feelings. He wrote, "For her, that plane crash was God pointing his finger at Kik and saying, 'No.'" That all fits. Rose still, even in death, is judging her daughter. I just want to say too, it is possible to completely disagree with the decisions of your adult child and yet not act in a way that is condemning, unloving, and non-relational. We have adult children, and sometimes their choices have required that, in fact, that we get over ourselves and still extend love and kindness despite choices that we wouldn't counsel them to make. And I think every parent at some point has to grapple with those things. And, can you still hold the view that what they are doing is wrong? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. We're not obligated to condone every choice that our child makes. But this is not a loving relationship. This is not a relationship where either woman, either Rose or Kik, is actually growing through the relationship. Instead, because Rose has cut off Kik, Kik is denied the wisdom and perhaps motherly winsomeness that could have helped moderate her to a position of wisdom over time. And instead, because she has been so cut off, Kik is like, well, I've already been disowned. I might as well make the choice I like. And she's left without her mother's input, and her mother is left without the joy of knowing her daughter through this season of life, and instead is just as she had been at the wedding. Now she's still in America at her daughter's funeral. This is how the chapter ends. Kik was buried alone in the English countryside. Her gravestone reads, "In loving memory of Kathleen, 1920 to 1948. She was given no last name." So that is Kik Kennedy, and it also ends part 4 of this book, which is titled "The Lonely Graves." So that was the telling of Mary Richardson Kennedy, whose grave we heard about, and then Kik Kennedy. So I would love to know from you guys, first of all, the first question that comes to mind is, are you someone who has walked through those waters of interacting with adult children with whom you have a significant disagreement, perhaps a philosophical or religious disagreement over the choices that they should make? And what has that looked like in your life, whether you were the child or whether you have been the parent? How have you seen that done well? That's the real thing that I would love to talk about. I bet we could all tell stories of, like Kik Kennedy and Rose, where it went awry, where it went into an unhealthy place. But I would love for all of us to benefit. Where have you seen it be done well? Have you seen situations where a parent and child, an adult child, have had a significant disagreement and yet retained relationship, and perhaps the parent has been able to retain some level of influence and affection for their child despite these disagreements? That's what I would love to hear from you. And then just in general, what did you think of Kik? The whole era was so sweet through the jazz age, and she's so distinct because of the placement in the book. I feel it's very clear who Kik Kennedy is. The next chapter that we are going to discuss is someone that perhaps you know. It's the start of part 5, which is Ted's Blondes, and we start out with Mary Jo Kopechne. So this book, Ask Not, has been so fantastic of a read. I really enjoyed this chapter. I loved hearing about Kik Kennedy, and I hope you did too. Until next time, you guys have a great day. Bye.